All right. Today we're going to take a look at some of the progressive presidents. Mainly, we're going to look at Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to look at William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. All right, so here's Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Let's start with Teddy Roosevelt, aka the Trust Buster, sort of, and we'll talk about sort of here in a second. Roosevelt's famous for being the first president to really go after the trusts. He breaks up roughly 40 different trusts. And again, prior to Roosevelt's presidency, the government and big business had been kind of working hand in hand. The government was protecting big business. They weren't regulating them. They weren't controlling them. They weren't setting rates. They were the hands-off, laissez-faire sort of approach. A lot of corruption, a lot of one hand washing the other scenario. Roosevelt steps in and kind of changes the dynamics by actually cracking down and starting to enforce things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, starting to actually go after some of these big trusts because, like we talked about, trusts are bad for the consumers, right? When we reduce competition, that's typically bad for consumers. Prices tend to go up, options tend to go down. So Roosevelt's looking to break up the trusts. He's going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission. He's going to make it illegal for rebates to be used in railroads. So rebates were this practice where if, say, like I'm Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and I'm going to use a specific rail line quite frequently to ship my oil or whatever, that railroad company wants to keep me using the rail line consistently because that's going to keep them in business. It's going to keep them like having continuously someone using their rails, shipping the goods. So they would offer Rockefeller a rebate. They would reduce the cost of shipping for him to keep him using their line continuously, day after day, week after week. This, however, helps reduce competition. It gives Rockefeller a leg up against his competitors. So rebates were an unfair business practice. You could say it's almost like another tactic that monopolists use to gain a monopoly. So with the Elkins Act in 1903 that Roosevelt pushed for, that's going to crack down on those rail rebates. And they're also going to use like things like the Hepburn Act, which is going to increase the strength again for the Interstate Commerce Commission, give them more authority, more power to really enforce the Sherman antitrust laws and to go after businesses and corporations that were using monopolistic practices. So here's the political cartoon. Here's Roosevelt, and he's wrestling the railways. Remember, the railways were getting away with pretty much anything and everything in terms of monopolistic behavior. So Roosevelt's really cracking down on that aspect. Here's a link to another video that I'll post separately. Some high school kids did a video about Teddy Roosevelt and some of his policies. One of his sort of like his presidential plans was known as the Square Deal. So in his 1904 campaign for president, he promised every American that they would have the same opportunities across the board. So your background, your socioeconomic status, none of that mattered. Roosevelt is saying every American is going to get a square deal. He's going to make the playing field fair for all Americans. A square deal just means kind of like, hey, it's a good deal for everyone. So that's kind of how he's presenting things. So to make everything more fair, he's going to, enact some of these progressive policies, things like the Pure Food and Drug Act. He's going to crack down on, well, not he technically him personally, but he's going to create agencies that will really start to look into what is going into our food. Is it actually what it says it is? Is it being made safely, efficiently? Are the workers in these food industry plants, are they being treated fairly? All that sort of stuff. The Meat Inspection Act, that's another policy. That's another term that pretty much tells you exactly what it is, right? It's a law that's going to crack down on the meat industry and make sure that's safe. Roosevelt's also known for conservation, so preserving lands for the federal use, basically setting aside chunks of land like forests, canyons, whatever else, and saying, we're not going to touch this. We're going to leave it natural as it is and preserve it pristine and beautiful. Famous political cartoon here. Here's Roosevelt. He's got a rake, and he's kind of raking up the muck here. It says investigation on the rake. You can see it's all dripping and oozing, and there's like toxic fumes. You got a skull. It says meat scandal in there. So this cartoon is just kind of representing and symbolizing, Roosevelt's really willing to dig in and rake up the muck and get into the filth of things to create the reforms that needed to happen. Okay, yep, nature, just the picture kind of referring back to Roosevelt's conservation policies. And in this map, you can kind of see like areas in green. This is national forest lands. This is areas designated, set aside. With the government's not going to touch it. No one can own it. It's just open, beautiful parks and trees and nature. Wildlife and its habitat cannot speak, so we must and we will. Teddy Roosevelt. It's a little quote that kind of sums up his view and attitude towards why we need to set aside chunks of land. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, aka the Trust Buster. I feel like that moniker, that nickname, is unjustified because William Howard Taft is the real Trust Buster, uh, responsible for breaking up roughly 90 trusts. Roosevelt roughly 40. Taft breaking up 90, but he doesn't get the accolades. He doesn't get all the glamour that Roosevelt does. Roosevelt's such a glory boy. But Taft takes a more aggressive stance. He really has a very anti-big business stance. Roosevelt got some criticism for attacking just a small handful of trusts. Some Roosevelt argued were good for society. Some trusts were actually beneficial. Uh, so he went after some, left some alone, and some people were like, "Oh, if you're going to go after one, you got to go after all." And Taft was that guy. Taft was like, "Nope, monopolies, trusts across the board. None of them are good. I'm going after all of them, any and all of them." Taft is also going to continue to enforce and strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, election 1912. It's between Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Teddy Roosevelt is now running under his own party, the Bull Moose Party. And the outcome of this election is that Woodrow Wilson becomes the winner. Some major policies we want to be familiar with in terms of Wilson in his progressive era context. Uh, Roosevelt had the square deal. Woodrow Wilson has his policy, this campaign promise, which he called New Freedom. So he's going to focus on three major types of reforms: tariff reform, business reform, and banking reform. Um, he's also going to initiate um, things like the Clayton Antitrust Act, another step, probably the biggest step in strengthening the Sherman Antitrust Act. Um, it's going to set up commissions to basically really, really start to go after the trusts. All three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, really cracking down on the trusts. One could argue progressively each president does more and more to break up those trusts. But the tariff, a tariff is a tax on foreign goods. So Wilson is saying, hey, these tariffs, if we put a tariff on a foreign country, they're going to put it on us, and then it just goes back and forth, and that's no good. That's going to stifle business. So the Underwood Tariff Act basically pulls back on the tariff use. Business reform, we get the Federal Trade Act, which establishes the Federal Trade Commission, and this is going to be an agency that investigates any sort of unfair or illegal business practices. So if you're like false advertisement or you're just ripping people off, those sort of things, this is what the Federal Trade Commission does. And then the big one is in terms of banking reform. Throughout the late 1800s, even let's say all of the 1800s, we've had a series of like ups and downs economically, these boom and bust cycles. And then you'd get these panics, these dramatic downturns in the economy. It was very, very unstable. The economy would do well, it would do poorly. And when it did poorly, it crashed pretty hard. That's pretty detrimental to not just the economy, but for consumers, individuals. So the Federal Reserve Act is a way to sort of strengthen the economy and prevent these dramatic spikes and declines in the economic situation. So the way it works is in this picture here, you can see there's 12 different regions, these 12 regional banks, and they meet throughout the year to discuss, how the banking industry is doing in their particular region. And then they try and set policies and plans so that the banks are all kind of on the same page and not operating individually. So they also set federal well, they set like national policies or suggested interest rates, and it just kind of like evens the playing field so that things aren't so kind of wacky or subjected to these drastic bank changes or drastic changes in the economy as a whole. So again, the main thing here with the Federal Reserve, creating stability in our banking industry and creating stability in the economy as a whole. So again, here's some cartoons just kind of summing up Woodrow Wilson and his progressive policies. The Underwood Tariff Act, like I said, let's reduce those tariffs. We increase the tariffs, so is the other countries, and that stifles the economy. That stifles trade between the countries. So let's loosen up on the tariffs. The Federal Reserve Act, again, this is going to create regional banks, control the flow of money, and set a sort of standard interest rate. Preventing those drastic spikes in the economy. The Farm Loan Act, pretty self-explanatory. We're going to give low interest credit to farmers. It's going to make it easier for farmers to pay back these loans. We don't want to put more of a financial burden on farmers. They got it hard enough as it is. So this is Wilson's attempt to sort of create some reform to help out the farmers. Another big one is the Child Labor Act. We're going to limit the number of hours children can work in factories. Think about the negatives of industrialization, and one of the big ones was child labor and how dangerous it was and how they weren't getting educated because they're spending 10, 12, 14 hours, 6 days a week, 7 days a week sometimes. So that's another big push from Wilson as well, the Child Labor Act. All right, so that's our three big progressive era presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson.